or mussels in Scotland. And our speaker tonight is Donald Shields. And Donald is a member of our committee. He's a professional ecologist who's been working with freshwater pearl mussels for over 10 years, having surveyed several hundred rivers across Scotland in that time. He also worked on conservation measures for the species, including measures for habitat restoration, taking DNA samples from populations, and raising of awareness of this species, about which he'll say quite a lot. There's a great need to do so. He's published several papers and has been part of the teams that have won both Scottish Forestry Awards and the RSPB Species Champion Award at the Nature of Scotland Awards in 2014. Donald's the longest serving member of the Scottish Wildlife Trust North of Scotland Group Committee, having been elected and re-elected since 2012. And looking back in my very old SWT files that Heather Bantic handed me, Donald, I just happened to notice last night that you were involved in the group before you were elected onto the committee as well, because I noted that back in 2011, you were presenting to the local group on the birds of New Zealand. Do you remember that?
I do, yeah. I'd just come back from New Zealand then.
I take it that was the feathered variety, was it?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, they're fascinating species in New Zealand. Anyway, that's my introduction to Donald, and I'm going to hand over to Donald now to give us his presentation. So over to you, Donald, and just a reminder to everyone, if you could mute and switch off your videos during the presentation, that would be great. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, John. So it was a lovely introduction. I'm just going to share my screen, so if you could just let me know if that works. Does that work, John?
Yeah, that's worked, Donald, thanks.
No bother. Okay, so this is a talk about freshwater pearl mussels. There's a little thing at the top of my screen that's seeming a little bit odd. I don't know if that's there or not, but I'll just ignore it. So this is a talk about a species that means an awful lot to me and should mean an awful lot more to this country than it does. That's a picture of me surveying a river for freshwater pearl mussels. I cannot promise that that's the last picture of me bending over in a river that you'll see. I can't actually remember whether there's many more of them. So it's about conservation in the future of this species. I'm going to divide it into a few different aspects. First and foremost, natural history of freshwater pearl mussels. What are they? And then a little bit about the history of them in Scotland. Some of their threats, the threats that are sort of being posed to their populations, the current status and protections sort of around them, conservation efforts that are ongoing and have been planned, and questions as to what's going to happen next with them. Okay, so first things first, what is a freshwater pearl mussel? It's a bivalve mollusk, the phylum Mollusca. So all sorts of things like cephalopods and all that. Bivalve is referring to the sort of the two shells that they've got. Now it lives in rivers. It's a freshwater species, but until very recently, it wasn't believed that it actually really lived in still water and lochs. But there's sort of evidence that might be not the case, and they've found some in sort of larger sort of slow flowing bodies of water or lochs, and particularly in Ireland actually. It has a really, really fascinating life cycle that involves salmon or trout as a host species. We'll go through that as well. And it's also very, very, it's got very specific conditions that it needs to survive. It's quite picky when it comes to where it can actually live. It's what you would call an umbrella species. I always think if you get the river right for pearl mussels, you get the river right for everything else. And that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, a number of freshwater pearl mussels. You can see you've got a little sort of opening, and that's where they siphon food, organic particulates in through the water. These things can filter about 50, adults can filter about 50 litres of water a day. So the impact they have on cleanliness of water can be really sort of quite profound. And here's a picture that will show you a little bit about their sort of their interior anatomy. So you've got numbers 1 and 2 there. Those are the muscles that hold the shells together. They're adductors, I think is the right words. I can never remember if it's abductors or adductors. I think it's adductors. And then you have the large round ones in the middle, the 3 or 4. Those are sort of the gills that go in, and you've got the siphons, the apertures that bring in food and expel water, so they filter the water. One of the major differences between these things or there's plenty of differences, but one that you would notice is between them and the blue mussels, the ones you get at the seashore, is they don't have a gluey kind of beard that glues themselves to the rock. What they have is a muscular foot, which is number 7 there, and that will sort of bury down into the sand. Now, as I said, they've got a very, very specific life cycle. So you've got males and females, and the males will cast out sperm into the water, and after that, that will be inhaled by the female, which will fertilize the eggs, and they'll turn into what's called glaucidia, like little Pac-Men. And these glaucidia gets thrown out into the water column, and they have to get inhaled by a young salmon or trout and land on the gills of that creature, or they die within a few hours. So you're talking 99.999% of them die. Now, that might not sound like a very clever lifespan, but when you've got rivers that are packed with trout and salmon, it can be. They then live on the gills of the trout and salmon for a few months, and then drop off. And then when they drop off, they have to drop off into sort of sandy, gravelly ground so that they can bury in. And then they will live in that rough area for maybe 120 years. I mean, there's talk that they've found them in areas like Russia for they're maybe up to 200 years old. They're very, very long lived. There's one of the interesting statistics is that potentially you could have freshwater pearl mussels on the River Dee that were in the same place when Queen Victoria was fishing on that river. So they really are remarkable animals. That's a little microscopic image of glaucidia there, and they sit there and they snap shut like Pac-Man, like the old video game, until they actually can snap shut on the gills of the young trout or salmon. And that's an image there of the glaucidia sort of having infected. It's called infected the young trout. Now, there's been some work done on whether or not this impacts on the growth of trout and salmon, but I think it's been shown to an extent that it's really a negligible sort of impact that it has on the growth and survivorship of these fish. It doesn't really do any harm. However, this is an animal that filters a huge amount of water, so it's like a symbiotic relationship where it actually would clean the water and clean potentially gravel beds for salmon to breed in. So quite an interesting and complex relationship. That is what you would see if you're looking for pearl mussels in a river. You can see them just buried among the gravel, just the wee ends poking out. And sometimes you get more. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get loads of them. And they are phenomenal when you see them like that. It's a remarkable sight, but that's not a very, very common thing to see that. From a historical perspective, freshwater pearl mussels are remarkably important when it comes to British history. Excuse me. That is a man called Suetonius, who wrote a book called The Lives of the Caesars, or The Lives of the 12 Caesars, or sometimes it's just known as the 12 Caesars. Effectively, a book about the Caesars of Rome. And in this book, he points out just how much of a respect and a love that Julius Caesar had for pearls, and in particular, the pearls that came out of rivers, particularly in Britain. And that could effectively have been one of the reasons why Julius Caesar invaded Britain. So in the grand "what have the Romans ever done for us" kind of way, what have pearl mussels done for us, and what impact have pearl mussels had on this country that perhaps wouldn't have been the case had Julius Caesar not set his sights on them. Of course, over the years, pearl mussels have caused a bit of a stir and a stushy among the great and the good. Alexander I, who became king in 1107, he was said to have had the greatest collection of pearls of any man alive, and most of them, well, all of them, would have come from from Scottish rivers. Now, freshwater pearl mussels don't always produce pearls. It's something that happens. They're not 100% sure about it, but the best guess, or the best estimate, is that it's not like a grain of sand that creates the conditions to make the pearl. What it is a parasite. So they've sectioned pearls that are produced in some of the mussels, and they've kind of found a little sort of skeleton of something in there. They're not sure what. And some rivers produce more pearls than others, were known to produce more pearls than others. And as a result of that, it would probably be the case that the ones that produced more pearls were likely to have a higher parasitic load for whatever that parasite is. Of course, the pearls have been very, very important in terms of what people have wanted. The Scottish crown jewels, and indeed the British crown jewels are festooned with Scottish freshwater pearls, among other things. You see a lot of them there. Now, there was a massive survey done between 1996 and 1999 to look at the number of pearl mussels in Scotland. Now, pearl mussels are present across parts of Western Europe and Scandinavia and Finland as well. They also occur over onto the east coast of the northern part of the North American continent. But Scotland is one of the most important places, with potentially up to a quarter to a third of the breeding population, or the known breeding population, of pearl mussels. And so in 1996, there was a survey started to really map and see what the state of these pearl mussels was. And of all the rivers that they were found in, 155, of all the rivers that they were surveyed because they had evidence of mussels in them, whether that be from pearl fishers or various other things, juvenile recruitment, so young pearl mussels, they were only found in 52 rivers, and effectively 28% of them didn't have any youngsters in them at all. Of those rivers where they were known to have existed, 37% of them were extinct, and there was difficulty of actually finding information in 2 other rivers. But really, it wasn't a great picture. And from that point on, there was an amendment to the Wildlife and Countryside Act, which effectively protected freshwater pearl mussels completely. It is against the law to disturb or damage freshwater pearl mussels unless you have a license to do so from Nature Scot. So they really are sort of very, very heavily protected. This was repeated between 2013 and 2015, and this survey was really effective to see what 20 years had done to the species. And there was obviously further evidence of being found of other rivers. So new rivers were discovered which had pearl mussels in them. And there was obviously the assessment was done of those rivers that had been discovered with them previously. So since the first survey, that's me sort of measuring some mussels, which is how you help to age them. An additional 11 rivers have become extinct. 44 of the rivers, so an uptake, has shown no evidence of juvenile recruitment. But the good thing is the more rivers that were found that have had pearl mussels in them, more of them have had actually sort of juvenile recruitment. So there's a good thing, bad thing. And the new rivers have been found across Scotland. Now, this map here is a little bit obscure, but what it actually shows you is the areas across Scotland where you have pearl mussels and also where you have recruitment. So in some areas, the northeast, the north and the west, you've actually got quite a good amount of recruitment, but in the south and in the Northern Isles, there's just very little at all. So what that's been caused by, we're not sure, but that's something that is always sort of being looked into. Again, a change between the two surveys, what you can see is that in some areas it's very much an unchanged picture, but in some other areas it's been quite a bit of a decline. Now, it doesn't show you everything there because the way that the surveys are done, the gross numbers are not always sort of looked at, but in general it's not too bad, but it's not great. So where do you find them? Most of them are in the north and west of Scotland, these sort of well-known sort of salmon and trout rivers where there is lots of young fish which can help the mussels to breed. But as I said, the numbers of them are still becoming quite low, and only small numbers of rivers are really sort of having good sort of high numbers of them. As I said, the highest proportion of them is in the north and west Scotland, but that's also the area with the greatest area of decline. So again, good thing, bad thing. The picture you see there is your typical sort of equipment you would have to go and look to do mussel surveys. There's a bucket there, and that has a glass bottom in it, so you can see under the water. And that stick there has a cleft at the top. It's called a set of tangs, and that's what is used to sort of pick mussels out to have a look at them. You can take them out under license without causing them any harm. Those ones in the pictures there are all dead, and they were part of a pearl fishing kill, which I'll discuss a little bit later. But that's something that still goes on despite the fact that it's completely illegal now. So what are the threats to freshwater pearl mussels? Now, traditionally, pearl fishing was a huge one. People would go in and just collect all the pearl mussels and open them up, kill them, looking for pearls. And you know, you're looking at some rivers where that's, you know, 1 pearl in 1,000 mussels. So it really sort of impacted hugely on the ability of the pearl mussel to be able to, you know, replace itself, but also the numbers in general. And there were people that did it in a much more sustainable way, but in many cases it was not. It was just go in and get as many, just mass numbers of yes, get as many as you can, so you can get out, so you can just get as many pearls as you can find. The trade in pearls has been completely shut down as well. There's only a few licensed jewelers who are allowed to trade in Scottish freshwater pearls, and those are pearls that were collected before 1997 when the ban came into force. So they're not sort of collecting any more pearls, but obviously there's a black market for this sort of thing. Low host fish densities. I don't want to get into the woes of trout and salmon here, but that's another story. It's a very big story, but that also impacts on freshwater pearl mussels. If there's not salmon and trout, there's no way for these creatures to actually reproduce. So that has been a huge issue. Pollution and water quality. They are filter feeders. They are very much the canary in the coal mine, if you like. Freshwater pearl mussels, while they clean the water, any sort of heavy metals or any sort of pollutants, it'll just kill them. So some of that can be natural. If for example, a river eventually cuts through an area that has, a seam of lead or something like that in the rock naturally occurring, it will just kill all the mussels eventually downstream of that point. So that is an issue. But of course, the way we impact our waterways, there's a good picture of one, is quite an issue too. Climate change and habitat loss. Now, I'll talk a little bit about this in a little while, but effectively, freshwater pearl mussels need there to be a relatively stable bottom to the river. So the substrates of the rivers has to not move around too much. These are mollusks that can't move very much at all, not move far or fast. And so if there's a big amount of water going through and it pushes all the rocks about, that's what we would call an unstable area. And at that point, it just crushes all the mussels. And so they can't really live in those areas. Is that being exacerbated by climate change? I'll talk a little bit about that. Hydrological management, river engineering, canalization of things, the amount of water running off areas can be a huge area, and it can impact these previous 2 points with pollution and the habitat loss, the amount of area where they can actually find stable habitats. And other things such as non-native invasive species. Now, there's nothing that really eats freshwater pearl mussels. I think I've heard stories of one person that tried to eat one once, but apparently they're utterly disgusting. If they had pearls and they were edible, there probably wouldn't be any left anyway. But things like otters will occasionally eat them, but if an otter's eating a pearl mussel, it doesn't have long left. It will break down the teeth of the otter. It's effectively an old otter that can't catch its own food anymore. The only other time I've heard of animals hunting them would be crows, where they dive down into shallow water. If it's really low water levels, they'll pick out the mussels, and I've heard stories of them leaving them on the road for cars to go over so they can break them open, and then they'll get them that way. What we're talking about in terms of non-native invasive species, in particular up here, would be a ranunculus species called water crowfoot. Now, what's interesting about that is down south in England, where you also get areas with freshwater pearl mussels, not nearly as many, but they're, again, I'll speak about that in a wee while. They are one of the big sort of restoration projects is down there. it's a native species down there, and they seem to work well together. But up here where water crowfoot's been brought in, it can actually choke the bottom where freshwater pearl mussels are, and they can't get the amount of oxygen they need through with filtering the water, and they just choke. Now, there are natural threats. As I've mentioned, there's the occasional small bit of predation, but that's not really a huge thing. This is more of what you would see as a natural issue. This was on a river that had changed course, and effectively this area had been left high and dry, and in that stage pearl mussels, they will just die. They won't be able to survive in these areas. They can't move quickly enough, and so they die. So these are sort of some of the sort of main issues. Obviously, winter spates are a big issue, and in the areas where you do have more of a mix of sort of stable and unstable habitats, that a big winter spate can have a huge issue as well. Again, they can move, but not fast. Those are the trails of pearl mussels, which are trying to get out of an area which was in the process of being cut off. It was next to that previous picture just there. We actually picked some out from there under license to make sure that they survived. Now, climate change. I've looked at those natural threats. The trouble with climate change is we have an idea of what's going to happen, but we don't really know. We're kind of having sort of estimates. This is what happens when you have a very hot, dry summer to a mussel bed. This was in 2018. There was a massive drought where the river levels got very, very low. And what happened was a large number of mussels ended up out of the water. You can see the not just the mussels are out there, but also the sort of the water vegetation, which would normally be under the river. And thousands of these things died in that one spot. And within about 50 meters of there were thousands of dead mussels and dying mussels. That is another area, maybe about 20 meters from that previous photo, and this was an area that was being choked off. We had to effectively dig a channel from the main stem of the river to this one to keep these ones with water flowing into them. That is one of the issues with drought. We don't really know what's happening with spate water and the sort of the larger amount of water that comes down with the heavier flash flooding that we seem to be getting. We don't know this, it just seems to be more of an occurrence these days, and might become more of a thing. I'm actually involved in some work at the moment that's looking at that, and we've not come to any we've not got any firm findings yet, but it doesn't look good. So we'll watch this space with regards to that. There will be, I don't doubt there'll be sort of a little bit of media around that when we finally sort of get the final information about it. Poaching. Now, pearl fishing poaching is another issue for them. It's still ongoing, but at a much lower level than it used to be. But again, like a lot of things, when you have a smaller number of creatures because of a variety of other things, these additional stresses, pressures on the populations become disproportionately big. So if you have a large population, if there's a little bit of poaching, it might not have a huge issue. But the smaller the populations, as they have been getting, the more of an issue, the more of an impact it actually has. And there you go, a quick search on the BBC News website, and you come up with sort of regular, sort of almost once a year someone will find a new sort of freshwater pearl mussel kill. And that picture I showed you earlier with the bucket and the stick, that was a pearl mussel kill that I found. And when you work with pearl mussels, you end up finding it, that kind of thing, relatively, maybe every year, every other year. You find yourself giving police statements about it more often than you'd like to, unfortunately. But there are positives. Now, there is almost no freshwater pearl mussel population, so each river would be a distinct population. There's almost none that you would be able to say were natural. But in 2013, I was part of a team that went and did a survey, and we heard of, there was this river that had been rumored to be sort of really, really full, chock full of mussels, but had never been surveyed. So we went and we had a look and surveyed the entire river. It's only a short river, and we found effectively about 500,000 pearl mussels. And this is a small river where there's been no evidence of declines in because of poaching, no issues with works on the river or pollution, really. And the estate in which it's on has been sort of, they've been quite good at, they like the fishing, so they sort of have been stocking up trout and salmon. So to an extent, you would be able to say it's almost what a natural population of pearl mussels would look like. So I mean, that was a remarkable find. I mean, you think it's like going into an untouched glen somewhere where nothing has changed for, I don't know, 10,000 years. You just wouldn't find it. It was really quite remarkable. And we did 50-meter transects, and one of the 50-meter transects had something in the region of 4,000 mussels in it. So that's a 50-meter by 1 meter wide transect of the river. It was just really was quite remarkable. And if any of you are subscribed to the Journal of Conchology, feel free to have a look at it. But not only was that river really, really good in terms of its numbers of mussels, it was actually really, really good in terms of its population distribution, its the age cohort. Now, one of the problems, one of good things, problems, one of the issues with pearl mussels is there's a lot of rivers, as I said, that don't have recent recruitment, so all of the mussels are old. So you can tell roughly how old a mussel is after it gets to a certain age by the length of the shell. So on average, you would say that a mussel that has a shell length of 90 millimeters would be between 80 and 100 years old. Now, this shows a really broad distribution of shell lengths in this particular river. We called this river River X, and it's one of the issues with pearl mussels, but I will sort of come on to that. The distribution of this shows that there was recent recruitment. There was lots and lots of very, very young mussels. So that's what we would like to see in all the rivers, because that's a healthy distribution of these animals in terms of age and size. So what's going on to help this creature? It is really a creature that seems to be in a lot of trouble. It's important. It's culturally important. It is ecologically important. One thing I should note, I'll just go back to the previous slide. If you look at the shell length at the bottom there, until it's about 15 years old, that's when it reaches kind of sexual maturity. That's when it gets to around about 65 millimeters in length. So that would be sort of the age, the size we would say that's an adult mussel. So anything below that is considered a juvenile. So you can see in that there's a good number of juveniles in the surveyed portion. So 65 millimeters. There's a reason I'm repeating that. Bear in mind, there's a quiz later on. 65 millimeters. Anyway, on from that, what's going on with conservation efforts? There's a lot going on across not just Britain and Scotland and Britain, but Ireland and this sort of continental Europe. I don't know much about what's going on in North America, if anything, but there have been there's been a lot of effort into sort of helping protect this species. So fish stocking, obviously in this country, particularly in the Highlands and the lowlands as well, the borders, Dumfries and Galloway, there is a big culture of game fishing, so salmon and trout fishing. And so in actually where there's been problems with fish numbers, where they stock these fish, that's really been it's a good thing for pearl mussels, because these fish are the ones that we need in order to help the mussels breed. So it's an indirect one. There's rear and release, which is part of the Freshwater Biological Association ARC, which I'll talk about. There's habitat restoration, and again, that means different things in different areas. As I mentioned, for example, water crowfoot earlier on is something that doesn't have an impact down south, but up here does. The deliberate infecting of fish as well is something that can be a tool that can be used in terms of sort of helping this species along. And of course, emergency translocations. When those mussels were all sort of dried out in that drought, I spent a day with a colleague. We just spent moving thousands and thousands of mussels out of sort of really sort of vulnerable positions to get into sort of safer, sort of drier areas. And education. Now, I'll talk about education a wee bit here. Education is a funny one. There is, it's a well-known thing that the more people know about a creature, the more they care about it and the more they sort of will do to protect it. The trouble with freshwater pearl mussels is the more people know about it, the more people try and go and kill them. It's not not nice, but it's a very difficult thing to do. When you say freshwater pearl mussels to people think, pearls? How do you get the pearls? And it's a very difficult one. That's why when we published that paper about the natural river, the near natural river, we called it River X. We didn't disclose where it was from, where it was, because people would instantly have thought, oh, I can go there and try and get some pearls, make a bit of money. Education is very important in trying to sort of get people to care for these things. However, it's a bit of a double-edged sword with freshwater pearl mussels, unfortunately. So again, fish stocking. It's not direct, but it is critical. Without these fish, there is no future for pearl mussels. For example, there is a different kind of mussel in sort of southern Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, particularly the giant mussel. It's also sort of a Margaritifera mussel, so it's very closely related. It grows very big, and it has the same sort of idea of a lifestyle, a symbiotic lifestyle with a fish. Unfortunately for it, that fish is European sturgeon, and sturgeon numbers are, have been in catastrophic decline for a long time. They're not doing well at all. So in that sort of sense, there is very little hope for this creature because its host species has gone. Not gone, but not far off it. So that is, frankly, if you could do one thing to help freshwater pearl mussels, I would probably say fish is the main one, because that is the one thing that is long-term grant, will help. Rear and release. Now, this is what I talked about earlier. The Freshwater Biological Association have what's called an ARC, and this is at Lake Windermere, near Lake Windermere, in the north of England. And they've, over the past number of years, they've been rearing freshwater pearl mussels and tagging them either with numbers, as you can see in this picture here. This is literally just a screenshot of their website, which you can go and visit. And they've been putting thousands and thousands of these mussels into the River Urt. There's very, very few rivers left in England with freshwater pearl mussels populations. So they're trying to sort of really sort of push that along. So it's been a big long-term project. They've got lots of tanks there. You see the fish in the tanks that will be infected with glaucidia, large number of tanks, and then you've got the mussels in the bucket before they're translocated. This is a really, really interesting project. If you want to learn more about it, there is a talk by one of their senior biologists. I think that's the right title. A woman called Dr. Louise LaVictoire. I hope I've pronounced that right. And that's in May this year. So I think it's a free thing. It's not a profit thing. So that's another thing to look at if you wanted to look at that particular project. Habitat restoration. Now, the renaturalizing of rivers has been a huge thing, because canalization has been a massive thing, not just of rivers that have pearl mussels in them, but of the streams that lead into them. And what that means is water really flashes through and can cause bigger spates, more violent spates than would be previously in sort of under more natural conditions. That reduces the amount of habitat available to freshwater pearl mussels. So removing that, remeandering rivers, removing invasive species, and of course removing dams and weirs. The dams and weirs are one of the things that actually stop and have been shown to inhibit the numbers of salmon and trout, which can get up and down the river. And sort of removing them has been a big thing. In some areas, that's a much sort of a bigger focus than in others. There's a lot of work that's been done with the Forestry Commission. Obviously, the Forestry Commission is a major landowner in Scotland. Excuse me. And they've spent a lot of time and money on helping to sort of restore aquatic habitats in order to help freshwater pearl mussels. That's part of the work that I've been involved with. I didn't lead that, that I've been involved with, which has won forestry awards. And that's really to help restore these rivers and help pearl mussels as a result. But of course, up in Fennoscandia, I think I've got that right, because it's across Finland and Sweden, because Finland's not technically part of Scandinavia, I don't think. So I think that's the term they use. They've spent an awful lot of money removing dams and weirs from rivers to help renaturalize them. And this is as part of the way to help the rivers in general, but which also helps freshwater pearl mussels.
Right in front of us and like this.
Oh.
Just noticed.
Sorry, Donald, I'll just come in and say we've actually got, sorry for interrupting everybody.
Oh, that's all right.
It's just to say that we've got 3 participants who are currently unmuted. Could I ask those 3 if they would kindly mute their microphones, because some of what's being said and some of the background sounds are coming through. Thank you very much.
Okay, so one of the other things that has been tried and trialed is deliberate infecting. So taking fish in rivers of trout and salmon and infecting them with freshwater pearl mussels. There's been various projects that have done that. I think they've done it across a variety of river catchments in Scotland. There was a project in 2012 that ran for 4 years, 2012 to 2016, called the Pearls in Peril Project. And it was a European Life project. I don't know if we'll be getting any more of them, but they infected thousands of fish, and they used trout and salmon across various different ones. The upper Garry of the the sort of the Ness catchment being one of them, and that's really a really sort of good, again, another good thing to do. The one sort of issue with that, I suppose, is there's no way of knowing how many of these mussels actually went into sort of growing, and yeah, but these are all good projects that really sort of have done an awful lot of good work to help sort of reduce the issues that pearl mussels have. Again, emergency translocations, they're not ideal because you don't want to have to do them, but they are very, very important. I did promise I couldn't promise I wouldn't be showing you another picture of my bum when I'm bent over a river, but there we go. That was on a river where we found thousands and thousands of them, and we just spent the whole day just clearing them up and trying to get them into deeper parts of the river. One of the issues with that, of course, is with a river that has now got an area that's not habitable because it gets dried out in drought. If you have more of spatey weather in the winter, the stable area where you can have mussels where they don't get killed by boulders going all over the place is much smaller, because the spates in the winter cause it to be less stable. This is another river, not that one, it's a different one, where over 10,000 mussels were moved from dry areas. That's one that was that died just because it was left high and dry. It really is sort of the climate change issue could be quite significant, and could become more of an issue than many of the other ones as well. So from what we've had so far, what can we conclude? So over the last 100 years, this endangered species has been lost from much of its former range. Scotland's extant pearl mussel populations continue to be of international importance, but their continued decline since the first national survey in 96 to 99 is of great concern. So what do we do? Where do we go from here? The truth is, I don't know. There is so much, so many threats to this creature, and a creature which is really, really sort of, it's not big, it's not charismatic, it's not an eagle flying above, the hills, or a deer or an otter or anything like that. It's small and it's obscure and it doesn't get much love. But I think in terms of its historical importance, I mean, I said that it was written about in the biography of the Caesar. As far as I'm aware, the freshwater pearl mussel is the first animal that was written about in Britain. Any writings that have been done in Britain, the first animal mentioned was the freshwater pearl mussel. So it's a hugely important cultural and ecological species. What can we do? Just keep raising awareness, keep fighting the good fight, as it were. Land management could be an issue in terms of sort of the issue with climate change. Having a more sympathetic management of the uplands where there's less sort of flashing of water off the hills for sort of variety management. That could reduce the impact of winter spates and summer droughts, potentially. But who knows what the future will bring? Obviously, pearl fishing is still an issue. It's not as big an issue, but it is still an issue. And the smaller species there are smaller populations, it becomes more of an issue. The number of fish as well, trout and salmon, if they don't have their own problems to find, and if they disappear, then pearl mussels will eventually disappear. And of course, political indifference. politically no one cares about pearl mussels. We did have a species champion. It was Mary Scanlon. She was the pearl mussel species champion. Then Alexander Burnett, I think, was the next one. I don't know if there is one now. I'll have to double check that. So yeah, it's really it's not a, you know, it's not a hugely positive outlook, but there is hope. And as long as people are willing to put in the work and the effort to saving this species, then there always will be hope. So we gave it a wee name, the mollusk of the Glen, and there's a nice picture there with some juveniles all the way up to mature adults. But yes, we've just got to keep going and keep working hard. And that's the end of the presentation.
Missed most of it. The clash.
Thank you very much, Donald. Could I just also repeat my request to ask those of you who have microphones on to switch them off? 2 of you have managed to do that, and there's now another 2 who have got microphones on, one of whom was just coming through. So if you know how to mute yourselves, I'd be very grateful if you could do that. And we're now into questions and discussion. Some of you may have joined the meeting after I made a plea for everyone to submit their questions on the chat function, which is the only way that we can deal with them tonight, unfortunately. We do have a couple of questions up on the chat function, but for those of you who might not have heard my earlier plea to do that, there's still plenty of time to put your questions up during our forthcoming discussion. So feel free to put in questions on the chat function. If you could keep them short, that's helpful. So Donald, thank you very much indeed for that very comprehensive presentation. Fascinating, taking us from Julius Caesar and Alexander I to the present day. So you've covered a lot of ground. So a few questions that are up on chat already. I'll just go through some of these and see how we got on. So a question from Hebe to everyone, and she's asking, are all populations known, or are there still rivers that may have populations that have not been surveyed? And could you also say a little bit about the habitat, e.g. the depth or the substrate size or the flow, spateness, etc., in relation to where you're likely to find mussels?
Well, no, in answer to that, no, we've not got, we don't know all of the rivers, and we're always doing surveys. We're not always doing surveys. There's a number of people that do surveys each year as part of environmental impact assessments. There are sort of for building things, that are regulations that say that you need pearl mussel surveys done if there's likelihood that they're going to be there. But yes, we're always finding, we're relatively frequently finding new populations, very small populations, but new populations. The last time I found a new population was 2019, I think. 2019, yeah, and that was, but that was literally, you know, half a dozen mussels in a very, very small tributary of a river where they were known. Across Europe, particularly in the more remote regions of Fennoscandia, Russia, there is potentially more sort of mussels there, but particularly in the bigger rivers, where you can't get down to see them. The general methodology is using waders and sort of a wading staff, so you can't get too deep. They can live in any depth of water as long as it is covered, as long as it's permanently covered. They prefer it to be cooler. Obviously, cooler water is better for fish rather than warmer water. The salmon can't survive in sort of too high temperatures. Also, cooler water tends to be more, and moving water tends to be more oxygenated, which they require. The habitat has anything, as long as it's got a sandy bottom, a sandy substrate, they can bury into that with a foot. Sandy or gravelly. Mixed substrates are generally best, because if you get big boulders that are solid, that kind of protects everything else from moving about, creates a bit of turbulence, all that kind of thing. So yes, that's there's always more to find, hopefully.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Donald. Thanks, Hebe, for your question. A second question here from Hugh Rose, which is an interesting one. The distribution of shell sizes suggests a 200mm mussel would be very rare. He caught one while fishing for salmon and safely returned it. Roughly how old might that be?
Well, it's difficult to know. I've never come across one that big. The biggest one I've come across, I think, was 145mm. I mean, that's, you know, that's like a glasses case. It's pretty big. That's, I mean, that could be very, very old. In terms of how old, I don't know. As far as I'm aware, the oldest one that was accurately aged was 134 years old, I think, but very few of them are actually accurately aged. It could be 150 years old, that one. The ones that grow to 200, where I think might be 200 years old, sort of in the colder areas, tend to grow more slowly. So that might be a reason. So who knows, but that's a remarkable find. It really is.
Yeah. So there'll be a sort of standard deviation around that, depending on the circumstances that it had endured throughout its life.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that. Next question is from Carol, and she is asking, do water sports in a river where water is released a few times a year for that purpose have an impact on the mussels? And she's thinking of the River Morriston, for example.
As long as it doesn't disturb the substrates, then no. If it causes massive spates and moves all the substrates, then it could do. But if it's just sort of, I mean, the Morriston, it's dam controlled, but the impact of that is probably not too much. Again, water sports are probably not an issue, because people are just sitting on the water and there's not really an issue. They don't, you know, as far as I'm aware, they don't have ears, so you know, noise of things like jet skis wouldn't be a problem. Not that I don't think they've got them in the Morriston, but no, I don't, unless it's going to actually impact the substrates or bring down toxins or whatever, it's not going to have a huge issue.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Donald. Next question's from Robert, and he is asking, are there any populations you've found that seem more resilient to drought or other pressures than others?
I mean, that would just be to do with the topography of the river bottom. So if there's areas, I know there's areas in certain rivers, for example, where I found the drought, sort of where the thousands of mussels were, there were areas of that river where it was generally quite deeper, even around to the sides. So where the level dropped of the water, it wouldn't have exposed the mussels underneath that. So I mean, it would just be purely down to location. There's nothing. I'm not aware of any mussels that are better at of this species that are better at tolerating sort of dry sort of weather. They can be out of water for maybe 20 odd minutes maybe, and they're not going to suffer any ill effect really, which is, you know, when you take them out and measure them before putting them back to get an idea of this of the sort of population age sort of distribution. But no, I don't think so, beyond the sort of topography of the river.
Okay, thanks, Donald. A question from Kenny Taylor. Would growth lines on shells be a proxy for year-to-year changes in a given river?
No, because you can tell how old a mussel is by the growth lines on it up to a certain age. So it's only up to, like, for the first 10-15 years of life, then it just kind of disappears. There might be some microscopic way of doing that with a dead shell. I don't know, but I don't think that it's not something that would be obviously done. And if there might be a way to do it, but that would probably be through sort of microscopy or sort of something along those lines. I may be wrong. That might be something that is doable, but not as far as I'm aware.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Donald. I've been wondering as you were going through your presentation, how many individuals or research groups are currently studying freshwater mussels in Scotland? I mean, the reason behind the question is, are there enough people involved in this subject area for the research that still requires to be done? The answer to that is usually no for all research subjects, I know. But I also wondered if it was a subject for which it might be particularly difficult to obtain research funding.
Probably, yeah. It's I mean, the closest thing I think we've had really to joined up is probably an unfair term. A national kind of body would be the Pearls and Peril Project, which ran 2012 to 2016. But yes, it's kind of somewhat disjointed, I suppose. There's not a national body overseeing pearl mussels. I mean, I would always say that there's not enough sort of money into it, but then, you know, as it's part of my job, I would. There's a number of people doing it in terms of the conservation value. Most of the people that I can think of that work with pearl mussels do so as an ecologist. So they do most of their work in mussels as surveying, and actually the conservation work isn't the stuff that pays the bills, as it were. So, you know, so yeah, I would probably say no.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I guess from what you've said that there are some benefits of conservation work that goes on for other reasons, which has a knock-on good effect for freshwater mussels, particularly in relation to fish stocks, etc., which is something to be thankful for. And I guess the same could be said for some of the conservation work now that's recognised as required for climate change, where, for example, rivers have no tree cover and the water temperature is rising. So any of that sort of work, albeit that it's going to take time, might have beneficial effects also in terms of temperature for freshwater mussels.
And given the speed of change in terms of the climate, that could be very, very important to get that done very quickly.
Yeah. Okay. I had asked a question written down on my paper here while you were in the early part of your presentation. You kind of came back to it and answered it, which was about, you know, I was wondering how much we knew about the level of poaching activity that goes on, and you came back and you said, you know, you find about one new site of evidence where there's been poachers. Do we know whether poachers always leave evidence of their activity? I mean, you would have kind of thought it might have been in their interest not to do that, or once they've done a particular area of a river, do they just think it doesn't matter to leave the discard because that area is done anyway and they've milked it?
Sounds to me, John, like you're trying to get me to tell you how to hide pearl mussel kill.
No.
Yeah, I mean, traditionally, what would happen would be that the people that did it was largely traveling folk. It was people, or there was families that as well that did it, but they would go, and because they would go to rivers where the pearl mussels were, and then they would go to the markets as part of their sort of routes. So they would have access to the mussels and then access to the market to sell them. And what some of them did was they would select the mussels that were more likely to have pearls in them, because there are ways and means to tell them apart. Some were not like that. Some would just kill all of them that they could find. But they would just grab, you know, a few hundred in a net bag, go and sit in the bank and cut them open and then leave them there. Since then, that still happens, but it's been a lot more sort of subtle since the ban has come in. And so people will like either just sit there with their mussels and chuck them back into the water so they're less visible,
Yeah.
or, you know, open them as they go. And, you know, there's ways and means of doing it. Yeah, I don't think people take them away any distance really, because as soon as they start dying, they start smelling. And if you've ever smelt or held a dead pearl mussel, I mean, the smell stays in your hands for days. It's horrific.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
But honest, I wasn't asking for hints there anyway.
I'm just kidding.
There's no further questions come up on the chat meantime, Donald. So I think what we'll do is, bearing in mind that we've got the quiz to come, I think we'll close the discussion there. So if I could just, on behalf of everyone, thank you very much indeed for that fascinating talk before we move on to the next part of the programme. And those of you who have been dying to unmute, I would ask you to unmute very briefly while we give Donald a very well-deserved round of applause for telling us about a subject which I guess very few of us knew much about, and covering it so comprehensively. So thank you very much indeed, Donald. And a few of us at least will unmute.